As the investigation into the FLDS church in Texas continues to unfold, Nate Eaton brings the story closer to home with shocking new information and revelations from a former wife of Jessop.
Dogs were no longer to be allowed among the people of God, and in one day he had all the dogs taken from the community or killed.
One woman tells all.
Before I got to Salt Lake, Merrill had my brother's shop surrounded. He was scouring the city with the FLDS men looking for me.
Nate Eaton investigates. An Eyewitness News special report tonight at 10, only on Channel 3.
5 weeks ago, the reclusive fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was thrust into the national spotlight. The state of Texas reportedly received a phone call from an FLDS teenager who claimed she was being abused.
Now that call resulted in authorities seizing over 400 kids. Tonight you'll meet a former FLDS member who escaped the faith because she says the abuse was just out of control. Nate Eaton investigates.
Carolyn Jessop was a member of the FLDS Church for 35 years. Tonight you'll see her unbelievable story of growing up in and escaping from the faith.
This is my mother's sister, Rhoda.
You've seen the pictures. Smiling polygamous wives surrounding their husband.
This is my Uncle Parley.
What you may not know is many of them are related to people here in eastern Idaho.
Growing up, we had visited Colorado City several times.
Like the Larsen family.
My mother's one sister and two brothers joined into polygamy in the 1940s.
Richard Larsen's immediate family never practiced polygamy, but they had several aunts, uncles, and cousins who did. Years ago, two of Richard's cousins married this man, Carolyn Jessop, the first counselor to Warren Jeffs, and the man in charge of the FLDS compound in El Dorado, Texas. One of Jessop's other wives was this woman.
I had 8 kids in 15 years.
Carolyn Jessop, born into polygamy.
We all believed that our only way to God was through plural marriage.
And raised FLDS.
How old were you when you got married?
I was 18.
And did you choose your spouse?
No, nobody does. I mean, it's not acceptable to choose your spouse.
The man who did choose her spouse was Leroy Johnson, the prophet of the church at the time, and the only person who could decide who was to marry who. There was no flirting, dating, not even talking to people of the opposite sex. One night, Carolyn's father told her the prophet wanted her to marry Carolyn Jessop.
Merrill was 50 at the time. I was 18, so he was 32 years older than me. I had seen him, I knew of him, I had been in the same room with him, but to actually meet him, like the two of us talk, no. That had never happened.
2 days later, Johnson married the couple. Jessop already had 3 other wives, and 3 months after Carolyn's wedding, he married 2 more women. Carolyn was instantly thrown into a house with jealous wives, a husband she didn't love, and dozens of children, whom Carolyn says Jessop constantly abused. If it wasn't emotional, it was physical, like a water torture practice.
It's where you take an infant and you spank them violently, and then you hold them face up under a tap of running water. And then the cycle is repeated and repeated and repeated until the baby is so out of breath and exhausted that it's not able to fight anymore.
Carolyn says the abuse was bad, but believed she was living God's will. It wasn't until Warren Jeffs started to gain more control of the religion that she started to question her beliefs.
Warren one day decided that dogs were no longer to be allowed among the people of God, and in one day he had all the dogs taken from the community or killed.
Jeffs also started talking about a center place where righteous FLDS members would gather and be isolated from the rest of the world.
I saw that as compounds.
Around this time, Carolyn's son was diagnosed with cancer. She knew if they moved to a compound, she would never be able to get him treatment. She knew she had to leave, but that would be nearly impossible.
If you're going to try a crazy stunt like this in the FLDS, failure is not an option.
Coming up in 2 minutes, the unbelievable story of how Carolyn escaped with her 8 children.
Before I got to Salt Lake, Merrill had my brother's shop surrounded. He was scouring the city with the FLDS men looking for me.
After spending her entire life in the FLDS faith, Carolyn Jessop risked her life to save herself and her children. Carolyn Jessop knew she had to escape. If she was going to do it, it had to be when all of her children were home and her husband was gone.
My fear was Merrill would have taken my kids away from me, basically put me under house arrest, and I would never have been allowed to see my kids again.
Carolyn asked her brothers, who lived in Salt Lake and had already left the FLDS church, to help her. They agreed to meet up at a gas station 3 miles outside of Colorado City. Finally, on April 22, 2003, at 4:30 in the morning, Carolyn knew it was time to act.
All of my kids were sharing rooms with their half-siblings, and so I had to sneak into a room, get them up, and try to get them dressed without waking up their half-siblings. And I heard over the intercom that Merrill wanted to talk to me on the phone.
Immediately, Carolyn knew one of Merrill's other wives had called him and told him something was happening. She frantically started to throw her kids in the van and was ready to go when she realized her oldest daughter, Betty, wasn't there.
I went running into the house. I found her in her room. She was crying hysterically. She's like, "Mother, something you're doing is wrong. Why doesn't Father know what you're doing?" And I said, "Betty, I will not leave you behind." And I grabbed her hand and then I ran with her to the van.
Carolyn took off and had to drive on back roads because men were constantly patrolling the streets. Even the police were FLDS and couldn't be trusted. Finally, she got outside of town to the highway and after nearly running out of gas, met up with her brothers.
Before I got to Salt Lake, Merrill had my brother's shop surrounded. It was just a nightmare.
It's now been 5 years since Carolyn left polygamy. She's blended into society and is currently working with the state of Texas in the custody case involving over 400 FLDS children. She believes the state did the right thing in taking the kids and hopes the abuse will now stop.
If they actually do prosecute and hold the people who are hurting other people accountable, I think it'll stop.
Now, Carolyn is the first FLDS woman ever to gain custody of her children. After years of counseling, all of them have blended into society except Betty. When she turned 18, she went back to the FLDS faith. As far as Merrill, she has a restraining order against him and they haven't spoken in 5 years. He now has at least 13 wives and over 100 children. One of his original wives, Fawnita, was excommunicated a few years ago. Carolyn says Fawnita wasn't told why. She was simply kicked out and left to the streets with nothing. For more information on this story, including a book Carolyn has written about her ordeal, visit our website at kidk.com. We'll be right back.